The gravel crunched softly under Taryn's boots as she stepped out of the taxi, craning her neck to take in the sprawling countryside around her. The air felt different here, clean, crisp, carrying the faint scent of lavender and freshly tilled earth. Before her stood the bed and breakfast, a charming stone building with ivy curling along its weathered walls and flower boxes spilling over with bright blooms. It was the kind of place she'd only ever seen in postcards. Too idyllic to be entirely real. Yet here it was, and here she was, seeking something she couldn't quite name. The innkeeper, a cheery woman with silver-streaked hair and a warm smile, welcomed her inside and gave her a quick tour. Taryn barely registered the cozy interiors, the antique furniture, or the crackling fireplace in the common room. She was already thinking about the view she'd glimpsed through the window, a patchwork of fields rolling into the horizon, kissed by the soft golden hue of late afternoon light. After unpacking her supplies in the snug room she'd been assigned, she ventured outside, her sketchbook tucked under her arm. The gardens flanking the inn were vibrant and alive, buzzing with the low hum of bees drifting lazily from one bloom to the next. Taryn's fingers itched to capture it all. She wandered aimlessly at first, letting the sights and sounds wash over her. There was a stillness here, but it wasn't empty. It was full, brimming with an energy that seemed to hum beneath the surface like a secret waiting to be uncovered. She found her spot near a wrought iron bench overlooking a small pond framed by weeping willows. The sunlight danced on the water's surface, glimmering in shifting patterns as the breeze stirred the leaves. Taryn sat cross-legged on the grass, flipping open her sketchbook and selecting a pencil from her case. She began with swift, loose strokes, aiming to capture the movement of the light, the way it played across the scene, like it was alive. Minutes blurred into hours as she worked, absorbed in her task. The world narrowed to the tip of her pencil, the scratch of graphite on paper, the shapes and shadows coming alive under her hand. For the first time in weeks, her mind quieted. The doubts that had trailed her like shadows, about her art, her purpose, her place in the world, faded into the background. All that remained was this moment, this quiet, this beauty. When she finally looked up, the sky had deepened into a soft amber, the sun dipping low. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, feeling the faintest flicker of what she'd come here for, inspiration. The kitchen was bathed in a soft golden light spilling through the wide-paned windows, the kind of light that seemed to turn everything it touched into art. Taryn had wandered in on a whim, following the faint scent of rosemary and something citrusy that teased the air. She hadn't expected the room to be empty, nor had she expected what she found waiting for her on one of the long wooden counters. An eclectic arrangement of ingredients, meticulously laid out with a precision that felt deliberate, almost reverent. She paused, tilting her head. It wasn't just a collection of food, it was a tableau, a still life. The glossy sheen of crimson peppers rested against the rough texture of a burlap sack half full of flour. A scattering of deep purple figs punctuated the scene, their delicate skins split just enough to reveal the jewel-bright interiors within. A single sprig of thyme leaned against a copper bowl, its placement so perfect it couldn't possibly be accidental. Even the way the light hit it all felt intentional, as though whoever had arranged it had been painting with objects instead of pigments. Taryn's heart quickened. An interactive installation, she thought, her lips curving into a delighted smile. How unexpected. How bold. She hadn't pegged this sleepy countryside inn as a place for experimental art, but then again, inspiration always showed up where you least expected it. Her hands twitched with the need to engage, to reimagine. Art like this wasn't static. It was alive, waiting to evolve, to transform. She stepped closer, her fingers brushing the smooth skin of one of the peppers. Then, with careful deliberation, she began to rearrange the scene. The figs became a focal point, their rich tones contrasting against the pale flower, which she poured into a swirling line like a river winding through a landscape. The sprig of thyme, once leaning, now arched dramatically over the copper bowl, which she tipped on its side, letting a few stray lemons roll free. Taryn grabbed a spoon and angled it just so, catching the light in a way that sent a glint of silver dancing across the counter. She stepped back, surveying her work, then moved a pepper to the left for balance, a handful of rosemary to the right for texture. She was so engrossed that she didn't hear the quiet footsteps behind her. "What?" a low voice asked. "Are you doing?" Taryn startled, spinning around to face the man standing in the doorway. Dark curls fell across his forehead, his arms crossed over a white chef's coat dusted faintly with flour. His eyes, deep and unyielding, locked onto hers, and it took her a moment to realize he wasn't admiring her work. He was glaring at it. She glanced back at the counter, suddenly unsure. "I thought it was an installation." "An installation," he repeated, his voice carefully controlled. "Those were the ingredients for tonight's dinner service." "Oh," heat flushed her cheeks. I thought it was. I was just trying to contribute." His jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might explode. Instead, he exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "Contribute." His tone was flat, almost deadpan. "Well, yes." She gestured toward the counter. "It's more dynamic now, don't you think? More evocative?" He stared at her, incredulous. "I think it's ruined." Taryn winced. "Ruined feels a bit strong?" He stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over the rearranged ingredients with a mixture of frustration and disbelief. "Do you have any idea how long it takes to prepare this? To make sure everything is just right?" "I didn't mean," she started, but he cut her off. "Do you always walk into kitchens and improvise with other people's work?" "Not usually," she admitted, her voice small but tinged with defensiveness. "But it spoke to me." His mouth twitched, and for a moment she thought he might smile. Instead, he shook his head, muttering something under his breath as he began to salvage what he could of the arrangement. Taryn stood awkwardly to the side, her fingers fidgeting at her sides. "For what it's worth," she said hesitantly, "it's beautiful. Your work, I mean." He paused, his hands stilling mid-motion. For the first time, his expression softened, not quite forgiving, but no longer as sharp. "It's dinner," he said simply, but there was a flicker of something else in his eyes now. Curiosity, maybe. Recognition. Taryn nodded, folding her arms across her chest as she leaned against the counter. "Well, dinner can be art, too." He didn't respond, but as he turned back to his salvaging, she caught the faintest hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. The kitchen was quiet, except for the faint scrape of a knife against a cutting board. Taryn hesitated in the doorway, her fingers curling around the doorframe. She had come to apologize. Her late-night wanderings had taken her back to the kitchen, and it seemed serendipitous he was here. But the moment she saw him, all her rehearsed words scattered. The chef stood at the counter, his movements precise but unhurried. His dark curls were slightly disheveled, as though he'd been running his hands through them in frustration, and his sleeves were rolled up to his elbows, revealing forearms dusted with flour. He didn't look up when she entered, though she was certain he'd heard her. Taryn cleared her throat. "Hey!" His knife paused mid-slice. Slowly he glanced over his shoulder, his expression guarded. "You're back," he said, flatly. "Yes, She stepped into the room, feeling uncharacteristically awkward. "I wanted to say I'm sorry about earlier." The chef turned fully now, crossing his arms. His dark eyes studied her, unblinking, the weight of his gaze unsettling. "Sorry for what exactly? Rearranging my mise en place? Or for assuming it was some kind of art project?" His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a tautness that made her wince. "Both," she admitted, folding her arms across her chest. "I shouldn't have touched your work. I didn't realize." "You didn't realize," he repeated, his tone unreadable. He leaned back against the counter, the corner of his mouth twitching in what might have been amusement or irritation. "What exactly did you think it was?" Taryn bristled, her defenses flaring. She wasn't used to being on the receiving end of this kind of scrutiny. "I thought it was an installation," she said, lifting her chin. "The way everything was arranged, it looked intentional, like a still life. It was beautiful." His brow furrowed, his expression flickering with something she couldn't quite place. "It wasn't meant to be art," he said after a moment. "It was meant to be dinner." "I know that now," she replied, trying to keep her tone conciliatory. "But isn't it possible for it to be both?" His lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment she thought he was going to dismiss her outright. But then he sighed, running a hand through his curls. "Food can be art," he allowed reluctantly. But not when someone decides to improvise with it 5 hours before service. Taryn felt the sting of his words but refused to back down. I wasn't trying to ruin anything, she said, her voice firm. I was inspired. That's what I do. I see something, I feel something, and I act on it. It's instinct. Instinct, he echoed, his tone skeptical. Yes, she said, crossing the room now to stand a few feet away from him. And maybe that's not how you work, but it's how I work. He interrupted, his voice rising slightly. You think this is just about how I work? This isn't some abstract process, something you can rearrange and reinterpret on a whim. It's deliberate, precise. Every ingredient, every placement, it has a purpose. And what's the purpose, she shot back, her eyes narrowing? To make something perfect? To impress someone? To follow a recipe to the letter and never stray from it? Where's the creativity in that? His jaw tightened, and for a moment, silence stretched between them. Then, to her surprise, he let out a short, humorless laugh. You don't know anything about me, he said quietly, shaking his head, or about what it takes to do this. And you don't know anything about me. Her voice softened now, the fire in her words dimming, but not extinguished. I'm not trying to dismiss what you do. I know it takes skill and discipline, but I also know that sometimes the best things come from breaking the rules. His eyes finally softened, the sharp edges of his frustration easing into something else. He looked at her for a long moment, as though seeing her in a new light. Breaking the rules, he repeated, his mouth twitching again in that almost smile. Exactly, she said, and despite herself, a small smile tugged at her own lips. The tension between them lingered, humming like a taut string, but beneath it was something else. A spark, faint but undeniable. For the first time, Taryn saw a glimmer of openness in his expression, a curiosity that mirrored her own. Don't touch my kitchen again, he said finally, his tone lighter now, almost teasing. Deal, she said, holding his gaze. But as she turned to leave, she couldn't resist adding, unless, of course, inspiration strikes. He groaned softly, shaking his head as she walked out, but not before she caught the faintest hint of a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. The gardens were quiet in the early morning, the kind of quiet that carried weight, like the world was holding its breath. Dew clung to the petals of the roses lining the stone paths, glittering in the soft light of dawn. Taryn wandered aimlessly, her hands buried deep in the pockets of her sweater, her sketchbook tucked under one arm. She wasn't sketching today, though. Today, her mind was too restless. She paused by the lavender bushes, running her fingertips over the silvery leaves, breathing in the calming scent. Her thoughts, however, were anything but calm. They circled back, again and again to the kitchen, to him, the chef. She still didn't know his name. He hadn't offered it, and she hadn't asked. But his face was etched in her mind, the dark curls that he kept raking his hands through, the streak of flour he hadn't noticed on his sleeve, the way his gaze had pinned her, like she was a particularly puzzling recipe he was trying to decipher. She could still hear his voice, low and taut with irritation, asking her what she had been doing, and the way that tension had softened, just slightly, when she'd told him the truth. Taryn let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding and sank onto a bench near the pond. The willows that framed the water swayed gently in the breeze, their long branches brushing the surface. She traced the pattern of their reflections with her eyes, trying to distract herself, but it was no use. She hadn't expected him to linger in her thoughts like this. Their interaction had been antagonistic at best. He'd been precise, controlled, perhaps even a little rigid. She'd been impulsive, unapologetic, and entirely herself. They were opposites, and yet there was something about him, something she couldn't quite name, but couldn't shake either. He hadn't dismissed her entirely, she realized. He'd been angry, sure, but beneath that there had been something else. Curiosity, maybe, or recognition. She wasn't sure. What she was sure of, though, was how his words had stuck with her. The way he spoke about precision and purpose, about everything having its place. It was so different from how she saw the world, but it wasn't without its appeal. There was passion in him. She'd seen it in the way his hands moved when he tried to salvage her impromptu sculpture. A kind of devotion that mirrored her own, though their mediums were worlds apart. She thought back to his expression when she'd said food could be art, the way his jaw had tightened, like he didn't want to agree but couldn't entirely disagree. And then that almost smile, faint and fleeting, but real. She found herself wondering what it would take to coax a real smile from him, what he'd look like if that guarded exterior cracked open just a little more. The thought made her smile, and she shook her head, brushing back a strand of hair that had fallen into her face. She was here to paint, to find inspiration, not to get caught up in the mystery of a man whose world was so different from hers. But as she rose and continued her wanderings, she couldn't help but think about their next encounter, because she knew, somehow, that there would be one. The dining room was quiet, the last of the guests having retreated to their rooms for the night. A single lamp above the counter cast its warm glow over the space, softening the edges of the stone walls and wooden beams. Taryn drifted in, drawn more by the golden light spilling from the open kitchen doorway than any specific plan. She clutched her sketchbook loosely under one arm, unsure of whether she was searching for a late-night snack or simply restless. He was there, of course he was. She paused in the doorway, unnoticed for the moment. The chef stood at the steel counter, his back to her, sleeves rolled up, a knife in his hand as he worked on a stubborn tangle of herbs. There was a rhythm to the way he moved, deliberate and fluid, as though even this mundane task carried some ineffable sense of purpose. "You're always working," she said, her voice soft enough not to startle him but loud enough to carry across the room. He glanced over his shoulder, one dark eyebrow arched. Most people would call it a job, and yet it feels like more than that with you. She stepped inside this time, letting the door swing shut behind her, the faint scent of something earthy and sharp, rosemary maybe, wafted toward her. He turned fully, setting the knife down with precision. "And you? You wander the gardens and paint until the sun sets. That doesn't exactly feel like work either." Taryn smiled at the faint hint of teasing in his tone. "Touché." She hesitated a moment, then ventured closer, leaning casually against the counter across from him. "Do you ever stop? Just put the knife down, step away from the stove and breathe?" He tilted his head, studying her with a mix of curiosity and amusement. "Do you?" The question caught her off guard. She opened her mouth to answer, then faltered, realizing she didn't have a good response. Instead, she shrugged. "Fair point." For a moment, silence stretched between them, while the only sound the faint creak of wood settling somewhere in the building. Taryn traced her finger absently along the edge of the counter, her thoughts shifting. "You know," she said, meeting his gaze, "what you do, it's not so different from what I do." His lips quirked in that almost smile she was beginning to recognize. "Still trying to convince me food is art." "Not trying to convince you," she replied, leaning forward slightly, "just stating a fact." He picked up a sprig of thyme, rolling it between his fingers as he considered her. "And how is it the same exactly?" "Well," she began, her voice thoughtful, "we both start with something raw, something unformed, ingredients, pigments, whatever. And then we shape it, we add, subtract, layer. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but the goal is always the same, to create something meaningful." He looked at her, his dark eyes steady, unreadable. "Meaningful," he echoed. "Yes," she said, her voice softening. "Something that makes people feel something, whether it's joy or comfort or nostalgia, even if it's just for a moment." He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze dropping to the sprig of thyme in his hand. "And what about you? What are you trying to make people feel?" Taryn blinked, caught off guard by the weight of the question. She thought for a moment, her fingers brushing the spine of her sketchbook. "Connection," she finally said, "to a place, to a moment, to something bigger than themselves. I think that's what all art is, really, trying to remind people that they're not alone." The corners of his mouth softened, and for the first time she thought she saw real understanding in his expression. He nodded slowly, almost imperceptibly. "That's not so different from what I try to do, then." Her lips curved into a small, genuine smile. "See, I told you we're not so different." His eyes flicked up to meet hers, and there was a flicker of something, maybe amusement, maybe curiosity, maybe something deeper. "Maybe," he admitted, "but I'd argue there's still one key difference." "Oh?" she asked, tilting her head. What's that? He set the time down, wiping his hands on a towel before leaning his weight against the counter, mirroring her stance. When I create something, people experience it in the moment, and then it's gone. A meal doesn't last, it's temporary by nature. But what you create, it stays. Taryn considered this, her brow furrowing slightly. Does that make it less meaningful, though? The fact that it's temporary? He shook his head. No. If anything, maybe it makes it more so. It's fleeting, but it leaves an imprint, like a memory. She held his gaze, struck by the quiet depth of his words. I never thought of it that way, she murmured. Most people don't, he said simply. The room felt smaller now, the space between them charged with something neither of them spoke aloud. Taryn reached for her sketchbook, thumbing through the edges absently to keep her hands busy. You know, she said, her tone lighter now, I think you might be a philosopher in disguise. He smirked faintly, pushing off the counter. And you might be a chef in disguise, though, judging by your work with my mise en place, maybe not. She laughed softly, shaking her head. Touché, again. For the first time, his smile fully broke through, and it was warm and genuine, lighting up the sharp lines of his face. Taryn felt a quiet thrill at the sight, and for just a moment, the world outside the kitchen seemed to fade away. The dining room was dimly lit, the candles flickering softly in their glass holders as Taryn leaned back in her chair, a glass of wine cradled in her hand. Across from her, the chef, who she had finally learned was named Adrian, sat with his sleeves rolled to his elbows and a faint, tired smile on his lips. Between them, the remnants of a meal lingered. A plate with a smear of sauce, the last slice of bread sitting forgotten in the basket, and a few scattered crumbs on the white tablecloth. The room was empty, aside from the two of them, the other guests long since retired for the night. I don't know how you do it, Taryn said, swirling the wine in her glass. Cooking for all these people day in and day out without losing your mind. I barely get through a painting sometimes without wanting to throw it out the window. Adrian chuckled, the sound quiet and low. It's different, he said. Cooking isn't about me. Right, it's about them, the people I'm serving. You make something you hope they'll enjoy, and if they do, you know you've done your job. But how do you deal with the pressure, the expectations? She pressed, leaning forward slightly. What if you serve something and they hate it? He shrugged, his expression thoughtful. Not everyone's going to like what you make. That's just part of it. You do your best, and you focus on the ones who do enjoy it. He paused, his gaze flickering up to meet hers. I imagine it's the same with your art. Taryn tilted her head, considering his words. I guess it is, she admitted, but it's hard not to take it personally, you know, when someone doesn't connect with what I've made. It feels like they're rejecting a piece of me. Adrian nodded, his eyes softening as he studied her. I get that, he said quietly, but maybe it's not about rejection. Maybe it's just not their taste. Doesn't mean it's not good. The warmth in his tone caught her off guard, and she found herself smiling. You surprise me sometimes, you know that? Why? He asked, arching an eyebrow. Because I'm a chef, and I'm not supposed to have opinions about art? No, she said, laughing softly. Because you're thoughtful, philosophical even. Adrian shook his head, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Don't let that get around. I've got a reputation to maintain. They fell into a comfortable silence, the kind that felt natural rather than awkward. Taryn set her glass down and rested her chin in her hand, watching him. He had a way of making even the simplest movements, tapping his fingers on the table, adjusting the cuff of his sleeve, seemed deliberate, like everything he did carried a quiet precision. It fascinated her, the way he approached life so differently from her own impulsive, messy way of doing things. I'm glad I stayed late tonight, she said suddenly, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Adrian glanced up, his dark eyes meeting hers. Me too, he said after a moment, his voice soft. There was something in the way he looked at her that made her heart skip. An openness that hadn't been there before, like he was letting her see a part of himself he didn't often share. It made her wonder what else he was hiding behind that quiet exterior, what other layers there were to him. You know, she said, a teasing smile creeping onto her lips. If I didn't know better, I'd say you're starting to enjoy my company. Maybe a little, he admitted, his smirk widening into a full smile. "But don't let that get around either." Taryn laughed, the sound light and genuine, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt completely at ease. As the candles burned lower and their conversation wandered from food to art to memories of their childhoods, she realized something she hadn't quite dared to admit before. She wanted to know him. Not just the surface-level him, but the real him. The man who spoke about food like it was both craft and passion, who listened to her like her words mattered, who had a smile that made her feel like the world was just a little brighter. And if the way he looked at her was any indication, he just might feel the same way. The soft hum of crickets filled the evening air as Taryn and Adrian sat on the stone steps leading to the garden, the glow of the inn's kitchen spilling out from the open door behind them. A bottle of wine sat uncorked between them, and Taryn's sketchbook rested on her lap, untouched for once. Adrian leaned back on his elbows, his gaze fixed on the horizon, where the last ribbons of sunset faded into the darkening sky. He looked comfortable here, she thought, as though the quiet of the world around him matched something in his soul. "Do you ever feel," she began, her voice quiet, "like you're chasing something you can't quite catch?" Adrian glanced sideways at her, his curls catching the faint light. "All the time," he said simply. She studied him, surprised by the honesty in his voice. "What is it?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached for the wine bottle and poured a small measure into his glass. "I'm not sure," he admitted. "I think it's the idea of perfection, of creating something that feels just right, not just for someone else, but for me." Taryn smiled faintly, drawing her knees to her chest. "I get that, but I think perfection might be overrated." He raised an eyebrow, his lips curving slightly. "Says the woman who spent an hour yesterday trying to get the light in her painting just right." She laughed, nudging his shoulder lightly with hers. "Okay, fine, but that's not about perfection. It's about truth, I think, capturing the feeling of a moment." "Maybe it's the same thing," he said, his voice softer now. "Perfection, truth. Maybe they're just different words for the same idea." Taryn tilted her head, considering this. "Maybe," she said, almost to herself. Adrian sat up then, turning to face her more fully. "What about you?" he asked, his tone shifting, becoming more serious. "What are you chasing?" Her fingers traced absent patterns on the cover of her sketchbook. It was a loaded question, and one she wasn't sure she had an answer for. "I guess connection," she said at last, "to something bigger than me, to other people, to the world. I want my art to feel like it matters, like it leaves an imprint." Adrian was quiet for a moment, his gaze steady on her. "It does," he said finally. She blinked, caught off guard by the certainty in his voice. "How do you know?" "Because," he said, a small smile tugging at his lips, "it's already left an imprint on me." Taryn's breath caught, the weight of his words surprising her. She searched his face, but there was no teasing there, no deflection, just quiet sincerity. "Adrian," she began, but he shook his head. "You said once that art is about connection," he said, his voice low. "I feel it when I look at your work, when I talk to you. It makes me think about things differently, about myself, about what I do. That's the point, isn't it?" Her chest tightened, a warmth spreading through her that she hadn't expected. "That's the point," she echoed softly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The night seemed to close in around them, wrapping them in its stillness. Taryn's hand brushed against his where it rested on the step between them, and though neither of them moved, the contact sent a quiet thrill up her arm. "Maybe chasing something isn't so bad," Adrian said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "As long as you're chasing it with the right person." Taryn turned to him, her heart skipping as she met his gaze. There was something new in his expression, something open, unguarded, vulnerable. She felt it mirrored in herself, in the way her chest ached with a sudden, undeniable clarity. "I think," she said slowly, her voice trembling just slightly, "I might have already caught it." Adrian smiled then, a real, unrestrained smile, and the sight of it made her feel like she was standing on the edge of something vast and beautiful. Without thinking, she leaned closer, and he didn't pull away. In the quiet of the evening, surrounded by the scent of lavender and the hum of crickets, they closed the space between them, falling into each other like they had been waiting for this moment all along. The golden light of the late afternoon spilled into the garden, stretching the shadows of the trees across the gravel path. Taryn sat on the edge of the old stone fountain, her sketchbook resting on her lap, but untouched. Her fingers traced absent circles along its worn leather cover, the motion more a comfort than a distraction. She felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest, an ache that had crept in slowly, growing heavier with each passing day. The sound of footsteps approaching behind her pulled her from her thoughts, and she turned to see Adrian walking toward her, his hands in the pockets of his apron. He stopped a few feet away, his dark eyes searching hers, their usual steadiness tinged with something softer, more uncertain. "You've been quiet today," he said. Taryn managed a small smile. "I've been thinking." Adrian raised an eyebrow, stepping closer until he stood beside her. "Should I be worried?" "No," she said quickly, shaking her head. Then, more quietly, "Maybe." He frowned slightly, the lines of his face shifting with concern, but he didn't speak. Instead, he sat down on the edge of the fountain next to her, close enough that their shoulders brushed. It was a small grounding touch, one that made her heart twist even more. "I need to tell you something," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Adrian's gaze didn't falter. "I'm listening." Taryn exhaled slowly, trying to find the right words. "When I came here, I was looking for something. Inspiration, clarity, I don't know, something to push me forward. This place, it's given me that. You've given me that." Adrian's expression softened, but the faint crease between his brows told her he sensed where this was going. "But?" She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the edges of her sketchbook. "But? I can't stay. I never planned to. There are cities I need to go to, galleries I need to see, people I need to meet. I have to keep moving, Adrian. That's how I find what I'm looking for." His jaw tightened, though his eyes remained steady on hers. "And what exactly are you looking for?" The question hung in the air between them, and Taryn wasn't sure she had an answer. Or maybe she did, but it wasn't one she was ready to give. "A place that feels right," she said at last. "A place where I can create something that matters." Adrian looked away then, his gaze drifting to the fountain's rippling water. The silence stretched, heavy and unspoken things filling the space between them. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and even. "And this place, it doesn't feel right?" Taryn reached out, her fingers brushing lightly against his forearm. "It does," she said earnestly. "More than I ever expected. But it's not about a single place or a single moment. It's about the whole journey. I have to follow it, even if it means leaving things behind." Adrian turned back to her, and the weight in his eyes made her chest ache. "Including me?" Her breath hitched. "No," she said quickly, fiercely. "Not you. I don't want to leave you behind. That's the last thing I want." He studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded slowly as though he'd made a decision. "So don't." Taryn blinked, startled. "What?" "Don't leave me behind," he said, his tone quiet but firm. "Go, do what you need to do. But don't let it be the end of this, of us." Her throat tightened, and she looked down at her hands, at the sketchbook in her lap, as though it might hold the answers she couldn't find. "It'll be hard," she said softly. "I know. We'll be far apart. I know. I don't even know how long I'll be gone." Adrian reached out then, his hand covering hers, grounding her in his touch. "I know," he said again, "but I also know what I feel for you, and I don't think that's something distance can take away." Taryn looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "What if it's too much? What if we can't make it work?" He gave her a faint, almost crooked smile, the kind that always seemed to soften something inside her. "Then at least we'll know we tried. But I don't think that'll happen. I think we'll find a way." She searched his face, finding nothing but sincerity in the depths of his gaze. It steadied her, gave her the courage she needed. Slowly she nodded. "Okay," she whispered. "We'll try." Adrian's smile grew, warm and full of quiet hope. He squeezed her hand gently before letting go. "Promise me something?" "Anything," she said, her voice steady now. "Don't stop chasing what you're looking for," he said. "But don't forget that you've already found something here, too." Taryn swallowed hard, feeling the truth of his words settle deep in her chest. "I won't forget," she said. "I promise." They sat there for a long time, the fading sunlight casting golden hues around them, neither of them speaking. There was nothing more to say. Not yet. But as Taryn rested her head on Adrian's shoulder and his hand found hers again, she felt the fragile beginnings of something that could last. Something worth fighting for. Something worth holding on to, no matter how far apart they might be. The morning was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt heavy, like the world itself was holding its breath. Taryn stood at the edge of the gravel driveway, her suitcase resting by her side. The taxi idled a few feet away, its engine a low, steady hum that seemed to fill the space where words should have been. She turned her head, her eyes scanning the familiar contours of the inn, the ivy climbing the walls, the soft glow of the early sun brushing the edges of every stone, the garden she'd spent so many mornings wandering. It all felt surreal now, like she was watching it from a distance, even though she was still standing there. Adrian stood a step behind her, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. He looked the same as he always did, dark curls falling across his forehead, sleeves rolled to his elbows, but there was a stillness to him now, a tension that hadn't been there before. His gaze was fixed on her, and though he wasn't saying anything, Taryn could feel the weight of everything unsaid between them pressing down on her chest. "You'll call me," he said finally, his voice quiet but steady. It wasn't a question. "I'll call you," she echoed, nodding. Her voice caught slightly and she cleared her throat. "And you'll call me?" "Of course," he said, though the words felt fragile, like they might shatter under the weight of what they both knew. How hard this was going to be. Taryn hesitated, then stepped closer, her hand reaching for his. His fingers wrapped around hers, warm and grounding, but the touch felt fleeting, like the moment was already slipping away. "I don't want this to fade," she said softly, her eyes searching his. "I don't want us to fade." Adrian's jaw tightened, and he nodded, his grip on her hand firming. "We won't," he said, though there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes, so brief she might have missed it if she wasn't looking so closely. "We'll make it work." She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that missed calls, time zones, and the miles stretching endlessly between them wouldn't chip away at what they'd found here. But already, something deep inside her whispered how fragile this all was, how easily it could slip through their fingers. The driver honked gently, breaking the moment. Taryn let out a shaky breath and leaned up to press a kiss to Adrian's cheek. "I'll see you soon," she said, though the words felt thin, like a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. He nodded, stepping back, his hands slipping from hers. Taryn grabbed her suitcase and climbed into the taxi, shutting the door behind her. As the car pulled away, she turned to look back through the window. Adrian stood where she'd left him, his figure growing smaller with every second, the inn and the life they'd shared over these fleeting weeks fading into the distance. And yet, as the road stretched before her, she couldn't shake the feeling that something vital had been left behind. It started with a rhythm they swore they could hold on to, a call every evening, no matter how late, no matter how tired. Taryn would sit by the window of whatever city she found herself in, brushing flecks of dried paint from her hands as Adrian's voice filled the empty spaces of her hotel room. He would call from the back of the inn's kitchen, his words softened by the clatter of pots and the low hum of the dishwasher. They would talk about their days, their dreams, the little things that reminded them of each other. At first it was enough, but slowly the rhythm faltered. Taryn's shows began to demand more of her. Gallery openings, interviews, long hours spent hunched over canvases as she chased ideas that refused to take shape. Calls went unanswered, first by accident, then by necessity. "I'll call you tomorrow," she'd promise, her voice hurried and distracted. "I just need to finish this piece," and then tomorrow turned into days, then a week. Adrian tried to understand. He really did. But in the quiet hours of the evening, as he scraped plates clean in an empty kitchen, the ache of her absence grew sharper. For his part, Adrian wasn't always free either. The inn's growing reputation demanded more from him, more elaborate menus, more demanding guests, more time spent perfecting dishes he wasn't sure anyone really appreciated. His world had always been small, but now it felt stifling, and he hated how easily the weight of it made him miss her calls. When he did find the time, the hours between them stretched like a chasm. His messages became shorter, his voice tinged with something heavier. "Call me when you can," he'd say, but he stopped expecting the phone to ring. When they did manage to connect, it wasn't the same. Their conversations, once easy and intimate, became stilted, full of awkward pauses and apologies. "I'm sorry," Taryn would say, her voice cracking with exhaustion. "I'm trying." Adrian would swallow the lump in his throat and murmur, "I know," but neither of them believed it was enough. The days stretched into weeks, the silence between them growing heavier with each passing moment. And then, one day, it simply stopped. No fight, no final goodbye. Just a missed call that neither tried to return, leaving their connection to crumble under the weight of all they hadn't said. The gallery was packed, the low murmur of voices blending with the faint clinking of glasses. Taryn stood near the centerpiece of her latest exhibition, a sprawling canvas alive with bold strokes of crimson and gold, a turbulent, emotional piece that had drawn an awed crowd throughout the night. Critics circled her, leaning in with their notepads, asking the same thoughtful yet predictable questions she'd grown accustomed to. What inspired this collection? What emotions were you trying to capture? She answered with her usual grace, a practiced smile on her lips. "It's about finding beauty in chaos," she said, her voice even but distant, as though she were reciting lines from a script. They nodded, satisfied, and moved on, but her gaze wandered past them to the wine table in the far corner of the room. She caught her reflection in the glass door behind it, her sleek black dress, her poised posture, and barely recognized herself. Taryn was exactly where she had fought so hard to be. Her name was written in elegant letters on the gallery's white walls. People she didn't know spoke in hushed tones about her work. Yet as she stood there, surrounded by an audience that adored her, she felt hollow. The applause, the accolades, the success, it all passed through her like light through glass, leaving no mark. "Beautiful work," a woman said, pausing beside her. "The colors are so evocative. They feel personal." "Thank you," Taryn replied automatically, managing another polite smile. The woman lingered for a moment, her eyes searching Taryn's face as if expecting her to elaborate. But Taryn didn't. She didn't have the words, or maybe she simply didn't care to find them. Later, when the crowd thinned and the gallery lights dimmed, Taryn slipped out the side door, the cold night air a relief against her skin. She leaned against the brick wall of the building, closing her eyes and breathing deeply. For months, she had been working toward this opening, pouring every ounce of herself into the collection. And now that it was done, she was left with the same gnawing emptiness she'd felt before she started. Her mind drifted to the countryside inn she had left behind years ago, to a small, flower-dusted kitchen, and the low, steady voice of a man who had once made her feel like connection wasn't something she had to chase. She wondered if Adrian ever thought about her, if he ever wondered what might have been, or if, like her, he had learned to bury the ache under layers of work and the distraction of the day-to-day. Adrian stood at the edge of the dining room, his arms crossed, surveying the tables as servers moved gracefully among the guests. The hum of conversation filled the air, punctuated by the occasional clink of silverware against porcelain. The inn's restaurant, once small and unassuming, had grown into a destination, one that food critics now wrote about in glowing terms. Tonight, the room was packed, the diners savoring each artful dish he had spent hours perfecting. He should have been proud. He was proud, wasn't he? But as the night wore on, Adrian felt a familiar weariness creep into his chest. It wasn't the kind of physical exhaustion that came from long hours in the kitchen, though that was part of it. It was deeper, heavier. While the world outside the inn had taken notice of him, his reputation, his craft, his passion, he couldn't shake the feeling that it didn't matter. Not really. He stepped into the kitchen, caught the warmth of the ovens and the rhythmic sounds of knives against cutting boards greeting him like an old friend. The staff moved efficiently, cleaning up as the night wound down. Adrian poured himself a glass of water and leaned against the counter, watching them work. The head server, a kind-eyed woman named Clara, appeared by his side. "Another full house," she said, smiling. "The guests loved the tasting menu." That couple at table 3 wouldn't stop raving about the lemon thyme tart. Adrian nodded, forcing a smile. "Good," he said. Clara studied him for a moment, then tilted her head. "You don't seem happy." "I'm fine," he said, too quickly. "Just tired." She didn't press him, but he could feel her eyes linger as she turned back to the dining room. When the kitchen emptied, Adrian wandered outside, the crisp air biting against his skin. He walked through the garden, now quiet and still under the pale glow of the moon. The lavender bushes swayed gently in the breeze, brushing against his legs as he passed. He stopped near the fountain and sat on its edge, staring into the rippling water. It wasn't the first night he had ended here, seeking solace in the stillness. And it wasn't the first night he had thought about her, the woman who had once rearranged his kitchen like it was a canvas, who had challenged him in ways no one else had. Adrian didn't know why she lingered in his thoughts the way she did. Years had passed since she walked out of his life, but the memory of her had etched itself into him, as indelible as the scar on his forearm from a kitchen accident long ago. He didn't want to admit it, but there were moments, quiet, unguarded moments like this, when he let himself wonder if the longing he felt wasn't for a person, but for the version of himself he'd been with her. For all his success, something was missing. And though he couldn't name it, he knew enough to recognize what it felt like. An empty chair at a table set for two. The train rattled softly as it wound through the countryside, the rhythmic motion a soothing undercurrent to Taryn's scattered thoughts. She stared out the window, her reflection faintly overlaying the golden fields and distant hills. The landscape blurred, a patchwork of green and amber, broken only by the occasional tree or grazing animal. It was beautiful, she supposed, serene. And yet, she couldn't shake the knot of unease twisting in her chest. She hadn't planned for this. Her life was a blur of gallery openings, commissions, and flights to cities that barely felt real before she was off to the next one. Her calendar was full, her career was thriving, and still, she couldn't ignore the pull that had begun as a whisper and grown into something she could no longer silence. It had started with the smallest of things, a faint aroma of rosemary in a bustling cafe, a fleeting glimpse of sunlight filtering through ivy-covered walls in a city alley. A song that played in a gallery, its melody evoking a memory too hazy to name but sharp enough to sting. She brushed it all off at first, burying herself in her work, but the ache only deepened. And then the dream had come. She hadn't dreamed of the inn in years, but there it was, vivid and whole. The warm stone walls, the lavender bushes swaying in the breeze, and Adrian, watching her with those steady, unflinching eyes. She'd woken with her heart racing, a mix of longing and regret too heavy to shake. The next morning, without thinking, she'd opened her laptop and booked the ticket. Now, as the train began to slow, the knot in her chest tightened. What was she hoping to find there? Closure, perhaps, or answers to questions she'd been too afraid to ask herself. Maybe just a sense of peace, a chance to step away from the frantic pace of her life and remember what it felt like to simply be. The station came into view, a small platform nestled in the heart of the countryside. Taryn gathered her bag and rose, her legs unsteady beneath her. As the train hissed to a stop, she stepped out, her boots landing firmly on the ground. The air was just as she remembered, clean, crisp, and carrying the faintest whisper of lavender. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing it in. Then, with a deep breath, she turned and began walking toward the inn. The door creaked softly as Taryn stepped into the inn, the familiar weight of it giving way under her hand. For a moment, she stood still in the threshold, letting her eyes adjust to the dim light of the entryway. The place hadn't changed, not much anyway. The same worn rugs stretched across the wooden floors, the same collection of mismatched chairs gathered by the fireplace. The scent of the inn hit her all at once, wrapping around her like a memory. Lavender from the gardens mingled with something richer, warmer. She paused, her breath catching as she identified it. Lemon and thyme. Her chest tightened. She couldn't have forgotten that smell, even if she'd tried. It was the dish Adrian had made for her once, late at night, when the dining room had emptied and he'd coaxed her into staying for a proper meal. She could still picture the way his hands had moved with quiet precision as he plated it, how the golden glaze of the lemon sauce had caught the low light. She hadn't realized until now how much that memory had stayed with her. Taryn set her bag down carefully by the wall, her fingers brushing absently over the strap as her eyes swept the room. It was quiet, save for the faint hum of conversation from some distant corner. She thought she might hear the scrape of a chair or a laugh, but it was the aroma, soft, subtle, insistent, that seemed to fill the space, nudging at something long buried. Her feet moved before she could think better of it, carrying her toward the source. The dining room was empty, the tables set for dinner service. The edges of the polished wood caught the fading light spilling in from the windows, but it wasn't the room that held her attention. It was the doorway to the kitchen, a faint golden glow spilling out into the hall. The smell grew stronger as she stood there, hesitating. For a moment she debated retreating, slipping back out the door and vanishing into the countryside as though she'd never returned at all. But then she heard it, a quiet clatter, the unmistakable sound of someone moving in the kitchen. Taryn's heart thudded, and before she could stop herself, she stepped inside. The kitchen was quiet except for the rhythmic sound of a whisk against a steel bowl. Adrian stood at the counter, his back to the door, the golden light from the overhead fixture casting a faint halo around him. His movements were methodical, deliberate, but his shoulders held a tension that spoke of a man lost in thought. He hadn't noticed her yet, hadn't turned at the faint creak of the floorboards beneath her feet. Taryn stood frozen in the doorway, her fingers brushing the frame for balance. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. It was him, exactly as she remembered, and yet somehow different. His dark curls were shorter now, though still unruly, a streak of gray brushing his temple. His sleeves were rolled up to his elbows just like they had been the first time she saw him, and flour clung faintly to his forearm. The sight tugged at something deep inside her, a thread of memory that unraveled all at once. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came. It was only when she shifted, her boot scuffing against the floor, that he finally turned. His eyes found hers instantly. For a moment, neither of them moved. Adrian stood, rooted to the spot, the whisk stilled in his hand. His expression was unreadable at first, shock, perhaps, or disbelief. Then his gaze softened, and she saw the faintest flicker of something break through the guarded exterior he had always worn so carefully. Something vulnerable, something like hope. "Taryn," he said quietly, her name falling from his lips like a whisper, like a prayer. Her chest tightened at the sound of it, at the way he said her name, as though it had been waiting on the tip of his tongue for years. "Adrian," she replied, her voice trembling, barely more than a breath. She took a hesitant step inside, then another, each one bringing her closer to him and the weight of everything they hadn't said. "You're here," he said, his voice low, steady, though his eyes betrayed him. They held the questions she knew he wouldn't ask. Not yet. How? After all this time? "I'm here," she said simply, her lips curving into the faintest of smiles. She stopped just a few feet away, close enough to see the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the ones she had never noticed before, close enough to feel the pull of him, magnetic and unyielding. Adrian set the whisk down, his hands curling into fists at his sides, as though he wasn't sure what to do with them. For a long moment, he just looked at her, his gaze searching hers like he needed to confirm she was real. The silence between them was heavy, but not uncomfortable. It was full, brimming with all the unsaid words, all the emotions they had carried with them. "I thought about you," she said finally, breaking the quiet. Her voice wavered, but she met his gaze head-on. "Every day." His jaw tightened, his throat working as he swallowed. "Me too." The simplicity of the words stole her breath. She felt her pulse quicken, the knot in her chest loosening for the first time in years. And as she stood there, looking into his dark, steady eyes, she realized she'd been searching for this moment without even knowing it. Searching for him. Adrian took a step closer, his hand lifting as though he might reach for her, then hesitating. "Are you staying?" he asked. His voice quieter now, almost fragile. Taryn smiled, the kind of smile that came from somewhere deep, unshakable. "If you'll have me." Something broke in his expression then, the last of his guard crumbling. He exhaled softly, a sound that was almost a laugh, and without another word he closed the distance between them, his arms wrapped around her, pulling her close, and she sank into him like she'd found the place she'd been searching for all along. For the first time in years, the ache in both of them began to fade. And in that quiet kitchen, surrounded by the warmth of his embrace and the faint scent of lemon and thyme, Taryn knew she was home. The early morning light filtered through the tall windows of the kitchen, casting long, golden beams across the counters. Taryn leaned against the doorway, watching Adrian as he worked. He moved with the quiet confidence she had always admired, steady, precise, yet somehow graceful. His hands dusted lightly with flour, worked a ball of dough on the wooden counter, kneading it with a rhythm that seemed almost meditative. The kitchen smelled of fresh herbs and citrus, the air humming with warmth and life. It was a space she had grown to know deeply over the past months, though it still felt like a place of discovery. Adrian glanced up and caught her staring, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Are you going to stand there all morning, or are you going to help?" he teased, his voice low and familiar, carrying the affectionate tone that still made her heart flutter. Taryn pushed off the doorframe, a playful smirk on her face. "I think I'm more useful as an audience," she quipped, crossing the room to join him. "You're the artist here. I'm just the critic." "Oh, is that what we're calling it now?" he replied, arching an eyebrow as he wiped his hands on a towel. "I seem to recall a certain someone reimagining my mise en place not too long ago." She laughed softly, the sound filling the room like sunlight. "I thought we agreed that was the beginning of your creative renaissance." "Right," Adrian said, chuckling. "And yet somehow I'm still the one making breakfast." Taryn slid onto one of the stools at the counter, resting her chin in her hand as she watched him. "You wouldn't have it any other way," she said, her voice tender now, the teasing giving way to something softer. He paused for a moment, meeting her gaze, and the smile that spread across his face was slow and genuine. "Maybe not," he admitted. They fell into a comfortable rhythm, as they often did these days. Taryn reached for her sketchbook, which lived perpetually on the counter now, and flipped it open to a half-finished drawing of the garden. She sketched while Adrian worked, the quiet sounds of pencil on paper mingling with the soft clink of utensils and the faint sizzle of something warming on the stove. This was how their days often began, side by side, creating in their own ways, their lives weaving together like threads in the same tapestry. Later, as they sat at the small table by the window, sunlight spilling over their plates, Taryn reached across to brush a crumb from Adrian's sleeve. He caught her hand in his fingers warm and steady around hers. "You know," he said, his voice quiet but sure, "this feels right." Taryn tilted her head, her eyes searching his. "What does?" "This," Adrian said, gesturing vaguely at the room, the light, the moment between them. "You, us, all of it." She smiled, a slow, radiant smile that spread through her whole being. "It does, doesn't it?" He nodded, his expression open and unguarded. "I used to think I had to choose between the life I built here and someone to share it with. But with you, it's different. It doesn't feel like a choice. It feels like it fits." Taryn tightened her grip on his hand, her heart full. "That's because we're not giving anything up," she said. "We're just making more room." Adrian leaned forward, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead, and in that moment, the world felt whole. They had spent years searching, him for a sense of joy, her for a sense of belonging, and now at last they had found it, together. As the day stretched ahead of them, filled with work and laughter and quiet moments, they both knew this wasn't just a chapter. It was the beginning of a life they would build, not in compromise, but in harmony.